Well, welcome everyone to Industry Connect. I'm Mark Henderson, the CEO of AHI. Industry Connect aims to connect our industry and keep up to speed with the latest trends in business and technology. And today I'm interviewing award-winning journalist Luke Waters, and it's great to have Luke with us. Luke has had a distinguished career in journalism, which has landed him in some of the world's most complex, diverse and volatile events. From boardrooms to battlefields, elections to elite sport, he's interviewed the intriguing and the powerful, among them Governor General, gangland figures, ISIS operatives, and even a dictator. We might get to that. We might learn a bit more about that when we're talking to Luke. But Luke, I just want to welcome you to AHI and our Industry Connect channel.
Thanks very much, Mark. Great to be with you.
Luke, look, clearly from that intro, you've had an amazing career as a journalist, and you've covered things like the death of Nelson Mandela. You've covered war and conflict clearly in the Middle East and the Bali Nine executions in Indonesia, some big global events of the modern era. What's the one event that has had the most impact on you?
I think it'd be difficult to go past the Syrian crisis just for the sheer magnitude of the humanitarian fallout and the fallout, I think, economically, politically, and socially around that part of the world and indeed elsewhere in the world. I think the fact that it was so complex, there are so many sides, both on battlefields, but also international proxies being involved. But all of that aside, I think one of the things when you actually are there on the ground, it's hard to ignore is the humanitarian aspect. And I think the impact on civilians and seeing that firsthand, both the internally and externally displaced innocent civilian Syrians. And I think, the reality you see really closely that when there is a disconnect between a government and authority and the people, how quickly, there's a pounce from exploitation, whether that's particularly from child slave labour, exploitation of disability, child sex exploitation, and all those sorts of things. It's difficult to see, has an impact on you, but certainly that's the one that's been the most impactful from my career.
Yeah, and how do you balance that, Luke? I mean, you're working, you're living, you're amongst the community while you're doing your job. How do you separate the two? It must be quite challenging.
It is, and I was working for SBS at the time, and to their credit, they invested a fair bit in training for that type of operating in that type of environment. And some of that as well is, your mind and being able to separate potentially your job from the reality of what you're seeing and what you're doing. Yeah. And they also give you, I guess, without going into too much detail on that, some processes for you to follow. So you've got some things to check off. Are you making sure you're getting enough sleep? Are you trying to get a tiny bit of exercise when you can? Are you drinking enough water, not drinking too much coffee and alcohol, and all those sort of things, simple checklists, but they all add up to making sure that you're doing it okay. But I think the continuum that you do have there is your job. And the fact that you are working and you can, it does provide a little bit of a buffer between you and the reality of what you're doing. And
yeah, and when you're being across the table or across the microphone from the people that you've been interviewing, who's been the person who's had the most impact on you for whatever reason?
I suppose probably the most high profile and one of the more, for a range of reasons, was a difficult interview to secure was the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, because that was a matter of negotiating and dealing with the government for a couple of years before we granted the interview. And then obviously the logistics of getting there, and then the reality that it's inescapable that 100 journos at the time that I went over there hadn't returned from the country. So there's always the safety aspect and that sort of thing. So that was a different interview at a fairly high level that I'd not experienced in the past. So going through the preparation phase in the Syrian palace and all those sorts of things, and then actually doing the interview and then getting out of the country was interesting. But then on a different level, I guess one that had a significant impact on me was a couple of years ago in Indonesia, the fact that there's still literally hundreds of thousands of people that are shackled, and mental health living with mental health conditions, and interviewing them while they are literally on the end of a rusty chain and begging to get out of that. That's a really difficult thing to see. But that's all quite grim what I've discussed so far. But I think one of the most uplifting and memorable interviewees that I had and stories I had the pleasure of covering was a homeless fellow, and a fellow that had lived with a lot of disadvantage, who inevitably ran or eventually, should I say, ran the Melbourne Marathon. His name was Brian Presnell, unfortunately passed away a few months ago. But seeing a guy like that overcome such disadvantage and manage to run a marathon was quite an incredible story to cover, and SBS gave me the latitude to be able to cover that period of months in his build-up and preparation. So it's not all doom and gloom, but I guess your original question was which had the most impact, and I guess the Syrian crisis was one.
Yeah, I have heard about Brian Presnell's story, training on 1 meal a day to be a marathon runner. I mean, how awesome is that? What a great human being, and getting through what is clearly a challenging time. So, no, that's awesome. Thank you for that. Now, when did the journalism bug grab you, Luke? Do you remember the moment when you went, yep, that's what I want to do?
Probably a bit of a build-up, was never a single moment. My parents were pretty keen consumers of news and always encouraged me to look at situations from a range of different aspects. And it was when I left school what I wanted to do and what I applied to do, but I was unsuccessful in getting any of the cadetships or university entrances that I initially applied for. So it took a few more years before I eventually did some sort of self-paced learning and got a journalism diploma, and then embarked on the start of the career through regional New South Wales and some interesting little spots around Australia, and started from there. But the initial bug was probably from the parents who, again, keen consumers of news, and always encouraged myself and my sister to be informed, and I think it kind of started from there.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, they must be very, very proud parents, mate, with the career that you've had. Now, you've gone from the battlefield and covering some really interesting world global events, and now you're into media training. So you're passing on your skills and experience to professionals who may need to front the media one day. Can you give me an overview of that journey for you? You're moving into that world, and what do you hope that the people that you train and educate, what they walk away with when they attend some of your courses?
Yeah, I guess for a fair portion of my journalistic career, I was providing media training a lot of the time for other providers, and essentially just as a second job and what have you. But I always felt that the experiences I'd had were quite unique, and I felt that they could be applied to the interview preparation process, having seen quite a diversity of media spokespeople preparing, and to try and identify what are the things that the effective media spokespeople are actually doing, and how can that be applied to interviews across a range of sectors. And essentially, I think what people hopefully that go through my courses walk away with is a process. And I know it's perhaps an overused word, but I think if you've got a really basic process for understanding what an effective media message looks like and how to deliver it in a range of different environments, pre-recorded, live, broadcast, TV, radio, print, and online, then I think what you'll find is that you're, when someone taps you on the shoulder, either directly from the media or someone from your own media and communications team to do an interview, rather than all the anxiety running at your shoes, all of a sudden you say, well, actually, I've got something. I don't love it necessarily, but I've got a process to follow. I know how I'm going to consider my key messages. I know how I'm going to format them, and then I know how I'm going to deliver them in action.
Right. And are those, is that process work for if you're fronting the media from a, maybe you're delivering or responding to a critical incident or a controversial situation or something that maybe, life and death kind of thing? Is that process the same as you would if you were delivering good news or uplifting kind of messaging?
Yeah, so we look at perhaps separating interviews into 3 different phases of being proactive, reactive, or crisis. And the reactive is also potentially sometimes going to be referred to as issues management. But the process itself should be the same, because ultimately an audience is only going to be able to consume so many messages. So it's sitting down at the very start of that process and saying, okay, what are the things I need this audience to walk away with? What are the things that I, as a spokesperson, subject matter expert in this field with regard to this issue, incident, or situation, what's the things that they really need to walk away with? So being able to get the clarity around what the messages are, and then having a process to deliver them, again, whether it's crisis management, whether it's issues management or reactive, or whether it's proactive, the process is the same. Of course, in issues management, the questions are going to be a little more potentially hostile, and so there's a few other little interview techniques that we introduce, but that preparation process should always be pretty consistent.
Yeah. I've just had a funny thought in my head on thinking about crisis interviews, and recall a Tony Abbott interview 5 or 6, maybe 10 years ago, where he was asked a question, and I don't know if he did it on purpose or he just went blank, but he just didn't say a word for it felt like an eternity. So maybe that's a tactic not to apply in situations of crisis, perhaps.
Silence.
What's that, mate?
It was a long silence.
Long silence, awkward silence. So I can imagine, Luke, you're a so you're professional in our industry, in the sector, and you get the tap on the shoulder from your boss or the board or something along those lines, and you've been asked to go and jump on an interview. Maybe it's radio, for instance. How does someone who's not necessarily done lots of this just work through that? And you mentioned the word before, anxiety. How do they work through that so they can get some real clarity in their speech when it comes to that interview?
Well, again, I think having a process to follow is the most important thing in overcoming the anxiety, because if you've got a blank screen or a blank piece of paper and you're doing an interview, it can all get a bit overwhelming. But if all of a sudden you're saying, all right, well, here's the process I follow for developing those messages, and here's the process I'm going to use for delivering them, you've actually got something to work on. So it's a little bit like the question you asked originally: how do you cope with the hostile environments in the Middle East and that sort of thing? It is about having a process and having some coping mechanisms, and preparing for interviews really are no different. And I think it doesn't matter what the sector is, whether it's local government, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's a war zone or emergency management or higher education or epidemiologists that we see a lot in the media at the moment. There's a level of complexity to the subject matter. There always is that's inevitable. But having a simple process for preparing the messages and then delivering them, that's the challenge. And hopefully that's what the Saltwater Media Solutions courses do, is provide that process and that simple process.
Yeah. So just tell me, when you're training spokespeople, I mean, what principles do you follow? I mean, what does one of your sessions look like?
I guess if I could screen share for a sec, if that's okay. I guess if there's one guiding principle that's throughout the whole process, from the message development to the message delivery, it is simplicity. And I fully appreciate that our friend Mr. Jobs wasn't talking about media interviews when he said this, but it is highly applicable to the process. And investing time in preparation is the most important thing you can do. And a lot of people kind of think, sometimes when they're new to this, they'll think, well, perhaps we're over investing in the preparation. But when they get the difficult question, the challenging question, the question they don't want to answer, the simplicity of the messaging and the process that they follow will be their best friend. So the guiding principle is always simplicity. And the other one is this, just that very much preparation is the foundation of any successful interview. And without it, you might get through, you might cobble through and white knuckle through and get some semblance of a message through at the other end. But to be compelling and to maximise the chances of the audience consuming your messages, effective preparation is the most important thing.
Yeah, no, brilliant, and thanks for sharing that, Luke. That's good. Let's just go back to simplicity. So the Steve Jobs message is a really key one. I think he did simplicity really well, even in his design. But so are we saying keep the message simple, or find a way to deliver complex situations or complex messages with simple language? Are we trying to accommodate for the lowest common denominator who might be hearing your message? How do you kind of pull that one apart?
Yeah, it's all of the above, and I suppose having done a fair bit of training with higher education and medical research, I've grown to really loathe the saying of, "Well, we've got to dumb it down,"
Right.
and I know that some of the people there find that mildly offensive as well, because it's almost disrespectful to both the audience and also the subject matter expert.
Right.
But by simplifying it and having applying they say that the Herald Sun is written for a 12-year-old to be able to consume and read, and it needs to be written, the articles need to be written with that level of simplicity. I think approaching the message preparation phase with a similar mindset is really important, but I think having a structure for your messages is one of the key things that a lot of people perhaps don't do. So when I was a journalist, Mark, I found it unfathomable that spokespeople would come into media interviews and you'd interview them one day and then the next and then the next, and they'd have a different format for their messages, sometimes handwritten, sometimes bullet points, sometimes a screen, sometimes piece of paper, whatever it was. You know, if you're exposing your reputation and that of the organisation you represent to the scrutiny of a media interview, having a consistent format to me is the real start point for simplifying your messages. So making sure you understand how many messages you feel you need, what are those message supports going to be? So the validations, the statistics, the proof points that are going to actually reinforce those overarching key messages. They're the things that need to be considered in that phase. And that's why perhaps, you know, when we do look at this, you know, President Lincoln investing 4 of his 6 hours in preparation, that's why it's your best friend later on down the track, because you've got absolute clarity around what your messages are going to be.
Yeah, and I suppose that it's a bit like public speaking, I suppose. If you know your content and know your subject, you're going to be far more relaxed, I suppose, if that's a good word, far more confident, I suppose, in the message that you've got to deliver.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I was interested. There's two part question for you, Luke. First of all, what are some of the big mistakes you've seen people make in media interviews? Then I wouldn't mind talking to you about who you see in the media, maybe currently, who's a really good performer, and maybe work through why that's the case. So, first question: what are the big mistakes you've seen in media interviews?
Yeah, I would say that the most common errors, the recurring errors, and even from quite senior spokespeople in the media, is lack of preparation, and perhaps it's a complacency that I know my stuff. And so what can tend to happen is you've got executives or subject matter experts who potentially have superior subject matter knowledge to most people in the room, sometimes superior intellect, and they'll often get through a lot of communication on the basis of those things. But it's only when it gets to a media interview that these things are actually being pulled apart. So it's not going through that preparation phase. And the second would be, well, there's actually two more, if you could indulge me. One would be not getting clarity around the interview objective. I think people often race into crafting their messages and say, right, what are our messages going to be? And they end up with 6 or 7 different messages. If you can actually pause, sit back and work out what's the objective of this interview and state that clearly in one sentence, it actually makes creating those messages a lot easier, because rather than throwing them all into the mix, all of a sudden, if they don't address that interview objective, you can sit there and say, well, that's in the nice to have basket, but we really need to be clear about what message we need.
Right.
So again, people can get a little rushed and a little confident and not ask that key question around what's the objective. The next one perhaps would be potentially more often with senior spokespeople, but not verbalising their messages before a broadcast interview no fewer than 3 times. And it's so simple and so basic and so unsexy and so boring. But the truth is, if you've got your messages formatted in bullet points and you're taking them into either you remembered them or you're taking them into an interview in that format, unless you actually have clarity around where the start, the middle and the end of that message is, you can get yourself in a bit of trouble. And it is a common error. And again, if you don't mind, I could show you an example if we're talking about errors and people.
Yeah, please.
Mistakes. Here's a couple of gentlemen that, at the cutting edge of the world and the biggest issue confronting the world at the moment. And, did they prepare effectively? I would say no. Did they have clarity around what the objective of their interview was? I would say no.
Okay, let's have a look.
Take a look at some of these charts.
I'd love to.
We're going to look.
Let's look.
And if you look at death,
It's started to go up
here's
again.
one. Well, right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than
We're
the
lower
world?
than
What does that
Europe.
In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad.
Well,
Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
you can't do that. You have
Why
to go.
can't I do that?
You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases.
You got the vaccination? Yeah. Are you okay? I mean, you seem, no, it works. Or or the mom and dad, or the neighbor, or when you go to church, or when you're, no, I really mean it. There are trusted interlocutors. Think of the people. If your kid wanted to find out whether or not there's a man on the moon or whatever, something, or, whether those aliens are here or not, who are the people they talk to beyond the kids who love talking about it?
Yeah, they are some pretty worrying interviews there. But it does lead on also, given that the context around COVID-19 and the pandemic, to the second part of your previous question around who's actually doing well at the moment in the media. And perhaps we wouldn't have thought we'd be comparing epidemiologists a couple of years ago. We wouldn't have thought that'd be something we do. But I think if you look at Professor Nancy Baxter from the University of Melbourne, she delivers her messages really, really clearly. Catherine Bennett is another, and a personal favourite of mine is a paediatrician from the Royal Children's Hospital, Dr. Anthea Rhodes. I'm not sure whether anyone out there has seen any of her interviews, but in terms of really preparing clear messages and delivering them in a way that an audience of any level is going to understand, she's absolutely brilliant. But all three of those are kind of three that are personal favourites, if you will.
Yeah. Brilliant. Hey, Luke, we often talk about, from a business leadership perspective that, authenticity is really important for, good leadership. And the word sincerity does come in too a lot. But what about that sincerity in media interviews? How do you balance the need to be sincere and authentic, but also make sure that, the audience really hears your message?
Yeah, it is a tough balance. And I think the first part of it is that while this is media training and we do have a process to follow, it's still really important to be yourself, because if you're trying to be someone else, that authenticity and sincerity will diminish pretty quickly. And don't we all just hate the spokesperson that launches straight into their messages after they've been asked a particular question? And I think it's about acknowledging the fact that you are the subject matter expert and that you're the person that does have messages that the audience needs to know, but not being rude and ignoring the question or just jumping into yours. So we use processes around making sure that you address the question and perhaps explain why your point of view or the research that you've been involved in or the messages that you're wanting to deliver are really important. And that's part, obviously, of the training and the practical side of the training that we do. I guess the other point with that is to be able to back it up, because I think you lose the authenticity and the sincerity when you just deliver an overarching key message and leave it at that. Yeah. So it does get back to that preparation phase as well, and making sure you've got the message supports, the validations and the proof points that are actually going to humanise and put a bit of colour into those responses, rather than just table thumping and delivering an overarching key message, because I just think audiences are more sophisticated than that now, and that's not a valid way of communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. Luke, and just finally, one question I wanted to, such a strong track record as a journalist, right? So you come in, you're converted from journalism to journalism trainer. Now that doesn't happen overnight, does it? You've invested significant amounts of time in you converting those skills into a good, training delivery. Can you talk us through some of the things you've done to become accredited as a trainer in this space?
I guess probably part of it, I've got to fall on my sword here a bit, is being a bit of a nerd and being a person that unashamedly just watches a lot of interviews, a lot of press conferences, and it's pretty close to the way people communicate and the way they do it effectively, and then trying to simplify that as best I could, and getting this process together for the training. But I think one of the important things as well was doing workplace training and assessment accreditation, because I hadn't done that in the early phase of when I was delivering training for other providers. And I kind of thought, well, that's in the nice to have basket. That's not something I'll worry about. But the actual course itself did teach me so much about structuring training courses, practical and theory side of training courses, so as it would be effective for a whole range of spokespeople and potential spokespeople. So I think that was something that I found important. But the other thing would be that this is always changing. It's always evolving, and there are always people that are improving certain processes. So making sure you keep across who's doing well in the media, how they're doing it, what those latest nuances are, and making sure you can apply it to the sessions that we do.
Yeah, brilliant. Now you do, when the environment allows it, you do both in-person and online training delivery. So you're quite flexible as far as all that's concerned.
Yeah, so essentially the training sessions are divided into two deliveries. There's the theory component where we do go through the preparation and that sort of thing. That's all done. The majority of that's done virtually now via video conferencing, whichever platform people use. And that generally goes for around 90 minutes, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depending on how many participants and a whole range of factors. When pandemic restrictions allow, the practical session is face-to-face, and we do simulated radio, television, print and online interviews.
Yep.
Record them, play them back, and constructively critique. So between that theory and that practical session, we have some templates and things that we provide to clients so they can provide us with a really authentic and realistic and relevant scenario relating to their work. They'll prepare the messages based on either templates that we give them or their own method, and then we'll do those interviews in the practical session. I guess in the current environment, a lot more clients are doing both the theory and the practical via video conferencing, and for no other reason than that's what we're restricted and limited to at the moment.
Yeah, and it's we've found that with all the training that we deliver across Australasia, that flexibility is key. So that's great. Right, Luke, thanks for your time today and sharing with us and our audience on our Industry Connect channel. It's clear to me from what we've spoken about today that having those good media skills are just incredibly important, and a good probably a good skill set to have for most people. Even if you're not fronting the media today, you might be doing that in the future. So it'd be a good level of skill for most of our audience to maybe aspire to. So it's an interesting, and thank you for sharing all that you've done with us today. It's been great. Now we are going to run a workshop with you, which will be great. It's the 26th of October at 12:30, titled "Becoming a Confident Media Spokesperson." It's a 2-hour workshop, Luke, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Depending on how many people, it generally will be finished a little bit earlier, but it's around 2 minutes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so that's available right across Australasia. So our New Zealand audience, our WA audience, we're going to accommodate obviously the time zone challenges. So we're going to shoot for 12:30, middle of the day. And Luke, it'll be great to see how that goes for our members. I think they'll get a lot out of it.
I appreciate it, Mark. And just on the point you were making before, one of the most common bits of feedback we get from people who go through the courses are that some of these skills we talk about are portable. So while, it is really handy for media interviews, it's also good for business meetings and a whole range of other different communication processes. So it's been great to join you. Thanks for your time.
No, thanks, Luke. Look, I'm just my mind goes into different places, but I've got a household of 4 teenagers. Can I use some of these skills to maybe get them to clean their room or
put the bins out, all that sort of thing, and making
Do
sure
you think it'll work?
bridging back to message. It's got a track record of being inconsistent with teenagers, but most audiences are okay.
Okay, all right. Well, I might give it a try. All right, Luke. Again, thanks for your time, mate. It's been great to get to know you and Saltwater Media and the work you're doing, and we look forward to your workshop on the 26th of October.
Great. Thanks for your time, Mark. Appreciate it.